Hey guys, what's going on? Yeah, I kind of messed up my other video on Puerto Rican Flag Day, but once again, I wanted to wish everyone a happy Puerto Rican Flag Day. A little bit of history about the flag. It was finally legalized in 1952 after being banned for several years. It was first created in 1895 by Mariana Rossetti, and it was subsequently banned after that by the Spanish government. But after becoming free from Spanish rule in 1898 as a result of the Spanish American War, the United States took over the island of Puerto Rico, becoming a commonwealth in 1917. But because of revolts in the 20th century, it was later banned by the United States as well. And the specific revolt that I'm referring to is the 1939 Ponce Massacre. But in 1948, Puerto Rico elected its first democratically elected indigenous governor, Luis Munoz Marin. And under Marin's administration, the flag was finally um, legalized. But yes, this flag that we currently use is a very important symbol for Puerto Rican people, both from Puerto Rico itself and those living in other parts of the United States, like New York, because it represents a subversive movement to the people that occupy the island of Puerto Rico, but it represents a resistance movement and a freedom movement for those on the island, because we fought for our independence not once but twice in the 19th century with Ramon Imitario Betances as our leader and Pedro Albizu Campos as our leader in the 20th century, and Betances in the 19th. And of course, all the other um, mothers and fathers of the Puerto Rican nation, going all the way back to the Taino Indians before the occupation of the Spaniards in 1492. So it could go all the way back um, um, to the Taino caciques. You know, it's a deep and rich history. Of course, it's symbiotic of the Cuban flag because you know anything about history during the Spanish American War, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines all fought um, all fought together for their independence against Spain. They were the last of the Spanish colonies to get independence. The early ones, like Mexico and Colombia, they got their independence in the early 1800s, but it took us a very long time because of our sugar production to gain independence. At one point, we were a commonwealth of the Spanish crown. Aguebana. That was Aguebana was the cacique. I couldn't think of his name. The cacique that actually greeted Columbus when he landed in Puerto Rico in 1492 and um, changed the name uh, um, from Borinquen, which was the Taino language, the land of the noble, to the island of San Juan de Batista, the, which became the Spanish name. And then in 1519, Ponce de Leon then switched the name again to Puerto Rico. But up until this day, December 22nd, 1895, Puerto Rico used the Spanish flag of Castile and Leon as as their official banner. And then they switched from that to this, and then they switched back from this to the United States flag, and then finally in '52 from the United States flag to the one they use now. But yeah, it represents a symbol of defiance, an anti colonial symbol against two colonial powers, both the United States and Spain. Of course, Puerto Ricans are proud of their Hispanic heritage and proud of their American citizenship, but we had a history that goes back further than the United States and further than Spain. And of course, that history we share with other islands of the Caribbean, like Cuba, especially Cuba, because before the Europeans got here to the Americas, Cuba and Puerto Rico were connected in the Taino Arawak culture. So, yeah. Um, and like I said, when Puerto Ricans began to come to the mainland of the United States and they began to form the civil rights movement with groups like the Young Lords, they looked to the Puerto Rican flag because, again, it represented defiance and anti-colonialism, even to the point like the groups like the Machaderos actually um, went all the way up to the Statue of Liberty and put the Puerto Rican flag on the top of the Statue of Liberty. Certain groups like this get a bad rap because, and this was part of the reason why the flag was banned in the first place, because they tried to, even at one point, they tried to assassinate President Truman, Puerto Rican nationalists, because just like nationalists everywhere, like black nationalists, like Scottish nationalists, like, excuse me, Indian nationalists, you had your violent faction, your really hardcore faction led by Pedro Albizu Campos, who was killed by the United States. And then you had your compromising faction that was willing to compromise with the United States and settle for Commonwealth status. We had Commonwealth status in 1917, but some Puerto Ricans wanted to transition out of Commonwealth status to independent status, while other Puerto Ricans wanted to um, become an official state. That's always been um, that's always been a thing in the United States. And it's interesting that both the Puerto Rican flag and the Cuban flag are kind of modeled in design after the flag of Catalonia, which is an autonomous region of Spain that is linguistically different than Spain and culturally different than Spain. And often its relationship with Spain is kind of sketchy. So it's kind of interesting. Maybe a lot of the Criollos or the people of Spanish descent that came to Puerto Rico were from that part of Spain. But I do know that um, that the designers of the Puerto Rican flag, um, Antonio Velez Alvarado, he saw the Cuban flag outside his window in Manhattan. He was living there um, in exile, and he was inspired to create to design the Puerto Rican flag. And Mariana Bracetti was the one who sewed it together, kind of like kind of like Betsy Ross. You know, in American mythology, in American history, we're taught that Betsy Ross was the one that sewed the American flag together. So it was kind of interesting how the United States was a country was that was born out of an anti-colonial spirit against England, later later became colonialist in their pursuits in the Caribbean because they fought the Spanish American War to free the American territories from Spanish control and from European control. That was the point of the Monroe Doctrine. But later on, they went to on to colonize parts of the Americas. Panama for a long time. They constructed the Panama Canal. They went on to colonize the U.S. Virgin Islands. They went on to colonize, of course, Puerto Rico. So a country that was anti-colonialist later became colonialist. It was conceived in anti-colonialist rhetoric, and it later became colonialist itself. And it was also interesting how the region of Catalonia, which was kind of a rebellious problem, quote unquote, region for the mother country of Spain, kind of modeled their Puerto Rican people later and the Cuban people later modeled their flag after that. Sort of like how you had England and you had Scotland, and Scotland kind of um, became uh, the driver of American revolutionary fervor. Scottish descendants here in the United States, and particularly Scot-Irish descendants in the United States, became the drivers of revolutionary fervor. So they kind of held on to that genetic historical animosity, um, carried over into their new world existence, like just like it had in their old world existence. Same thing here with the Spanish. But yeah, the flag represents something really prideful. A lot of people wave it, in celebrations like the Puerto Rican Day Parade. And for Puerto Rican people, it's a small island and it's a commonwealth of the United States. It's not an independent nation like the rest of Latin America. But we are people that are very prideful of our country, prideful of our heritage, prideful of the symbols of our heritage, like the goki, like the flag, you know, like salsa music, like reggaeton music, things that represent our heritage. Because our heritage was so beaten down and because we were so marginalized and because our flag was banned for a number of years and because we were looked at as a rebellious, cantankerous people that will not be put down. And because um, at one time in the 1940s, um, Puerto Rican women were even sterilized in birth control test trials by the United States government. So um, that was that was a thing as well. A lot of people are talking about this vaccine that's coming out, and some people, plenty of people, are against the vaccine, particularly African Americans and Puerto Ricans, because of the history of the United States government being so um, evil in their actions, trying to exterminate us from the face of the earth, trying to sterilize the women to control the population, and also using us as cheap labor. One of the reasons why many Puerto Ricans immigrated to the United States after World War II was to help the United States economy grow, um, during that industrial boom of World War II. You know, immigration from Europe was limited because the European countries were engaged in a conflict against the United States. So countries like in Eastern Europe, countries like Italy, countries, especially Eastern Europe and Italy, where immigrants had come from previously in great numbers, they weren't able to come from Um, they weren't able to come from, during World War II, so they had to, um, for cheap labor, they had to pull from the resources that they already had, and two of those resources was the black community from the South, number one, and the Puerto Rican community from Puerto Rico, number two, because both groups were migrants, not immigrants, but they were so low on the totem pole due to racism that capitalist companies in the United States and abroad were able to exploit them. And they were able to use Puerto Ricans as cheap labor in a similar way that the British did people from India. So they shipped Puerto Ricans to Hawaii, they shipped Puerto Ricans to the U.S. Virgin Islands. But wherever they went, the two rallying points for Puerto Ricans as a people were the flag and the Spanish language. The flag and the Spanish language stood out as the defiance of American imperialism and American rule. Like, yeah, you can rule us legally and politically, but we're still going to maintain our cultural autonomy, and here's how we're going to do it: one with the flag, and two with language. So even though they tried to get rid of the flag, and the United States government tried to get rid of the flag and rid of the language, we in defiance of that conformity, Puerto Ricans continue to wave our flag and speak our language. Despite um, U.S. pressure, pressure from the United States, and particularly the government of Washington D.C. to not do so, and even to try to eliminate us with birth control experiments done on women and nuclear testing in the island of Vieques, which was a thing when I was growing up in the 90s. So, you know, that's all, guys. Happy Puerto Rican Flag Day to all the Boricuas out there. And I hope you take this time to really see, our national struggle that started the day Columbus landed on our island and tried to exploit the Taino Indians for profit. Then by the Spanish government, the Crown in Spain, and by the United States government. Because, like I said, and how it connects to our struggle now to resist government imposition. Whether it's a vaccine or it's anything. Because, like, if you want to get the vaccine and you feel like it's healthy and it's safe, then by all means get it. But if you're being told by the United States government that you have to get the vaccine and that you have to conform to their mandates and their dictates, that's BS, guys. You know, I mean, you want to stand against that because people of color and minorities have a history of not being treated so well and so fairly by the government and being dehumanized and being looked at as the other in this country and in all countries really, but in particularly as it relates to Puerto Rican people. In this post, how the United States government has done experiments on us, how they try to bomb our homeland, how they try to physically rape our homeland, and basically all Europeans since the day that they stepped onto our island. One of the reasons why we have a great proportion of European DNA in our DNA is because, well, when the conquistadors got there, they had sex with our women and they raped our women and they took our resources and they wiped out most of the Taino population, replacing them with African slaves. You know, what I mean, that's why we have the genetic composition that we have. I know we're very proud of that, that we're such a genetically diverse population, that we have that. We're one of the few countries and communities in the Caribbean that does have Native American heritage, because our our ancestors, our Taino ancestors, fought for that. Once again, they fought for their autonomy and they fought for their freedom. So that's something you guys have to think about as their modern descendants. You have We all stand on the shoulders of giants, guys. So we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, like Aquebana, like Pedro Aviso Campos, like um, Betances, who in each of their generations fought against tyranny and fought against oppression, and the young lords that fought against tyranny and oppression. So that's something you have to think about when you're having your health dictated to you by an authority in a faraway place like Washington, D.C., or like Albany, or like even San Juan, because remember, uh, you know, these might be democratically elected leaders, but these leaders are put there by Washington. We're allowed to sit, we're allowed to, we're like the Anakin Skywalkers of the United States, because we're allowed to sit there while Congress is in session, but we're not allowed to express our opinion. We have to be told that we have this leader as our president, who, um, us as the Puerto Rican Commonwealth are not even allowed to vote in national elections. So um, just remember that our ancestors fought not just for a flag, but for what the flag represents: the freedom and independence and right to self determination for our people. Peace.